Hello, my name is James Payne, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the MIT Sloan School of Management in the System Dynamics group. And today I'm here to present a summary of some of my ongoing work that was also part of my presentation at the 2022 Informs annual meeting. Now, even reviewing this work, I realized that sort of the summary of this work, the title that I provided to the meeting, could really be highly simplified, and simplified in a way that I think really summarizes most of this work, which is this idea that simpler is sometimes better. And that's a practical consideration. And I like that because really the field of operations management is a practical field, even back to its roots. You can go to Adam Smith and sort of some of his original conceptions around division of labor. You can go back to sort of Pratt and Whitney's interchangeable parts. You can talk about scientific management, which a lot of arguments about how scientific that ended up being. It sort of cut off huge chunks of what one really should consider in a fully integrated operation system that incorporates people. And then, of course, Henry Ford's assembly line. Now, the reason I'm bringing up these examples specifically is that even with the advent of sort of computing power in the 20th century, and really the explosion of operations management as a field post-World War II, a lot of this is built around sort of practical operating systems and policies that we can use to sort of streamline, simplify, and improve their quality. And even more recently, the concepts around sort of TPS and lean. Now, when we talk about sort of these integrated operating systems, we often think about these sort of serial operating systems come up quite a bit. When we talk about a serial operating system, we have to talk about bullwhip. Now, for this particular audience, I don't think this will be particularly new, but for those of you who want to review, bullwhip is this concept that as you move away from an upstream order perturbation, or you end up getting, in terms of information signals, you end up getting this idea of phase shift and amplification as you move further and further away from that original perturbation. What's interesting about bullwhip, and this has been shown sort of repeatedly, is it's structurally induced. It occurs even when you have, arguably fully rational actors, but it's behaviorally amplified. And why I think this is important is because back to this original concept around operations management as a field, this is of practical importance today. Ultimately, bullwhip is affecting global supply chains in our current lives. And I think the last 2 years have really illustrated how sort of important this is, not only with respect to these sort of early articles talking about the pandemic specifically and some of its early effects on both vaccine and food production, but even more recently, some examples around, GPUs with sort of a bit of a recent semi-crash post-Ethereum merge, even talking about things like, Nike's recently felt the sting of bullwhip, and even Scott's Miracle-Gro. This is just from the last couple of weeks. But interestingly enough, it's not necessarily all bad. Bullwhip is something that people are very aware of in serial supply chains. It's a practical problem, but also there are companies that have managed to manage around it thus far. So if you're a manager in this space, in sort of one of these serial supply chains, what do you do? And again, we're talking about sort of a practical manager, so I'm gonna give them a little hard hat here for the sake of safety. So I'm gonna assume that this manager is well-read and knows that, bullwhip and has been well studied, and there are a number of arguments around rational policies you can take within the space around base stock ordering quantities and the rest. But also this person is aware that he's in a behavioral environment. He or she is in a behavioral environment. And concepts around sort of behavioral ordering are clearly also shown over the last 60 years. And then also there's some information about maybe it's not just the people, but the actual setting itself, in which case there's some paper around that. Now, at the same time, though, maybe this manager is thinking to themselves, well, that's all well and good, but why can't I just throw a black box at this situation? And sure enough, popular press recently has really made a lot of arguments that would kind of support that idea of applying some sort of black box neural net or generalized machine learning algorithm at one of these problems. And even then, there's also some academic research to support sort of that line of thinking. So what this work is really intended to do is give that manager an opportunity to assess the relative contributions of those different methods and do so in a sort of a controlled and systematic way, and compare the performance outcomes of these different policies that might be implied from the existing research. So for this, just as a general note for sort of the way that you could approach this, because as I kind of stated before, there's a lot of different approaches. So the way that I'm approaching this is by first slicing up the problem into manageable subchunks around rule complexity, degree of adaptability of your policy, the incentive structure of your policy. You're talking about just me, or am I caring about the supply chain sort of at large? And then also this idea of information availability. Do I only have access to sort of the immediate world around me, or can I see something a little bit broader? Now, if you look at this, there's about 48 different total experimental conditions. What I end up doing is actually picking out a subset of 20. And the reason for that is because you can very quickly come up with this sort of full factorial design around behavioral versus sort of rational, learning versus non-learning, and then degrees of information. And then you have kind of these two extreme conditions of sort of the most simple ordering rule you can come up with, and then the most complex ordering black box rule you can come up with to sort of frame the space. So we take those set of 48, trim it down to a core 20. And for the environment, we're using the beer game, which I think, not to bury the lead, but I think that was sort of implied from some of the earlier slides, sort of a well-established, well-understood simulation model of the cereal supply chain, and one that we have some data on too from prior runs. So we can go ahead and take this and come up with, at least what we came up here, or what I came up with here, is this self-contained modularized version of the beer game, which then can be used in a multitude of different optimization and machine learning environments, including AI Gem, Keras, PyTorch, etc. And then also allow for models of human ordering decisions based upon existing literature. Right now I have sort of Sturman 89 for the majority of this presentation, but it could be any other thing. If Sturman and Dogan 15, Oliva 2022, Corson and Donahue 2006, as options for models of how people make decisions within this space. And for the rest of this presentation, the results I'm going to show are based around a total of 49 different teams that were fit to the Sturman 89 equation drawn from the original paper, and then several runs over 2021 and 2022 of the game online. So sort of a preview of the results, especially for the sake of time. Incorporating behavioral elements into your policy significantly improves performance. Complex methods like the DQN and sort of neural net approaches are valid in this space, but they achieve results at a high level of complexity and a lower degree of interpretability. And what I think is most interesting is relatively simple agents, ones that are myopic in terms of both of their optimization goal and sort of their information availability, can plausibly, under some specific circumstances, still be cost reducing within the space. So really quick about the different sort of policies that we construct, just to get into the nitty gritty for half a minute here. You can have this idea of a single shot policy. A single shot policy is one that you sort of pre-do. So this is that, back to that manager, this is that manager saying, well, I'm going to assume that I'm in a rational space with rational actors, so I'm just going to stick with a base stock policy. So choosing that level is one of our base stock agents. I have some notes here about how we choose specifically what that base stock level is. Effectively, it's a modification of the classic Clark and Scariff 1960 rule, with some modifications based upon recent research, because this situation doesn't quite perfectly fit the environment necessary for those optimality conditions. That person can also say, well, I know I'm in a behavioral setting. Clearly, the people around me aren't necessarily perfectly rational. I want to make an assumption about what their rule is. And given my assumption about how the people around me are going to act, I can then come up with my own rule ahead of time and sort of follow it as I move forward in space. So these are essentially pre-trained agents in the sense that you predetermine their reaction that they will have to their inputs and outputs, and then kind of run with it. Now, alternatively, to make that a little more complicated and add an idea of model prediction to it. So in this case, it's very similar to those pre-shot trained agents before, but now you're essentially doing that activity every time frame. And specifically what you're doing, and this is some poorly written pseudocode, so my apologies, is you're assuming a structure of your system, you're assuming orders for the others. You're then calibrating that assumption about your environment based upon what you've actually seen in the past. And then given that sort of assumed model of your environment, you then optimize your decisions going forward. Classic model predictive control, but we're applying it in this case to a behavioral model of your environment. And then and then part of that's important here is you have to define the observed space for the agent. So in this case, this is now where information availability comes in. You're talking about the minimal set off to the side here, where you only have access to like your one state variable. How much stuff do I have in my warehouse? Or the other end of this space, I can see information that I shouldn't have access to, like essentially the backlog of my suppliers and my customers, and even a couple other variables within that space. And then you have this idea of sort of a deep queue network policy. This is the black box. I've talked about this in some prior presentations. I won't spend a ton of time on this. This is mainly here as sort of an upper level on complexity for comparison purposes. One thing I'll state here is that the DQN that I develop here, which is available with all of this material online, specifically uses a split state and action space value from Wing 2015. which really makes this problem a little bit more tractable for the agent to solve. So some results. Let's actually jump into results for the second half of this presentation. So from a high level perspective, it's kind of a busy chart here, but I'll point out this, that with increasing complexity, we generally get lower costs, which is what we're looking for a particular agent. One thing to note, though, within this space is that the sort of different broad stroke classes of agents. So in the top corner there, you have your single shot pre-trained agents. In the middle, you have your model predictive learning agents. Then off the side, you have two different flavors of our DQN agent, one that is sort of uses its state space as an input and one that doesn't, kind of exist in three different sections of this graph. What I think is most interesting, though, is that while the DQN agent, it works within the space, especially in these middle positions. These results are shown for position 2 of 4. It does so at the cost of significant more complexity in terms of the general number of free parameters. So what I think is most interesting is actually the sweet spot right in the middle, where we have lower complexity but high cost reduction. So zooming in on that particular set, the question then becomes, what are the features of those agents that give us good results? So we're going to do, some fun regressions, but specifically what we're looking at is whether or not having a behavioral versus a base stock policy makes a difference, whether having a learning versus a non-learning policy makes a difference, and then of course together, does a behavioral and learning policy matter? And so regression tables, I know, are always kind of fun to look at in presentations, but just to draw your attention, one thing I think is most interesting within this space is that the default, the sort of baseline here, which is a base stock single shot pre-trained agent, still is able to generate about 50% cost reduction when it's able to be cost reducing. This matches prior literature in the sense that concepts around supply chain underweighting don't apply to this particular agent. It is consistent in its application of rules. However, applying a behavioral model on top of your base stock model gives you another about 7% cost reduction on average. And then additionally, the model here in which we start doing learning significantly improves performance even further. So now let's zoom in a little bit more and talk about those learning agents. So now, presupposing that we have an agent that's learning, now we're back on sort of the model predictive learning agent here. My next question then becomes ideas around how one sets up that learning agent. So you're assuming that you're learning. So do you having a myopic and a sort of a view of yourself versus a view of your team make a difference? And then how do the different levels of information matter? You just knowing about your own state variable, how much stuff do I have in my warehouse versus the value of you knowing more information about your supply chain. So again, another fun regression table, and again, the same sort of idea that the base stock agent, when learning, is able to achieve about 50% cost reduction. Similar observation to before. It's not subject to concepts around supply chain underweighting and information loss. Behavioral assumptions, again, start adding more value. But the part that I find most interesting, at least, is the lack of significance of these terms. Notably, that having minimal information is comparable to having near omniscient information within this space. So essentially, myopic agents, ones that are looking at, and also myopic agents, so ones that are looking at just themselves and only have access to only their own information, perform similarly to agents that are attempting to reduce costs across the entire supply chain and have near full knowledge of their entire supply chain. And then also I should note that most of these results, I'm showing results for position 2. My paper talks a little bit more about why that particular position is, I think, the best illustration, but these are qualitatively similar to other positions in the supply chain. Now, this kind of implies that, low information is just as good as high information. But there are some trade-offs. One thing is sort of stability of your model. So this is an example of the top one is when you have high information, the bottom chart is when you have minimal information. This graph essentially is a function representation of how quickly your agent discovers the truth, or at least a model of its environment. Note that while both achieve similar cost reductions, the bottom one is consistently updating its model of the world. So if this act of calibrating is expensive in some way, shape, or form, having high information offsets that cost. Additionally, the prior results were for agents that were cost reducing. Now, what's interesting within this space is that not every agent is necessarily cost reducing. Some, by their presence, actually are destabilizing, either marginally or in one case up in that top corner pretty significantly. So when do these stabilizations occur, if they do? And the answer is that they occur more generally. While they are rare in broad strokes, out of 49 cases, they happen at most, I think, 5 times in one condition, but typically much less. They happen more often when you have a myopic, low information agent. So really here, more likely, as I said, more likely in base stock myopic agents with low information, and simply did not occur with behavioral agents, especially ones that had a team level view. So some limitations and notes before I go much further. This is an empirically grounded, but not an empirically grounded simulation, because it's based upon sort of measures of real world ordering behavior, but it's not empirically verified. One thing I really want to do with this is actually take this sort of as a next step in a continuation of this research and place it in the context of a real run of the beer game with multiple people. This raises some interesting additional questions about sort of human algorithm interfaces and trust of decision support systems. But that's a separate stream of research that I'm hoping this sort of sets me up for in the future. Something else as well is that while these are behavioral based, they're still ultimately stable at the end of the day. And while this is sort of in the popular press right now, or there are a couple of good chapters, 9 and 10 specifically, in this book that kind of discuss the difference between sort of stability and non-stability within this space. So I need to add a little bit more noise in some future runs of this and make sure it's still, I suspect the results will be the same based upon some pre-testing, but something I need to do for this more sort of thorough analysis. Also, more recent runs of the beer game have implied that there is some subtle differences between in-person versus online runs. The data that I'm using is a mixture of those two. And something that I want to explore in the future is to really double check that those two sets, in-person versus online, are interchangeable, and there isn't a significant difference between behavior between those two. So in that, what is this? In my mind, there's some minor methodological contributions, which I've posted all to my GitHub and goes along with the main article, specifically the model predictive learning components of this. Something I haven't come across before, this idea of applying this model predictive learning methods to a behavioral assumption about your supply chain. So rather than applying it to sort of a physical model of space, you're applying it to a heuristic model of others and using that to then determine your own future action. And then the actual DQN tool used within this space, I think has some value. A lot of people recently, especially that 2021 article in IMSOM I referenced earlier, have done an excellent job, much more thorough job discussing DQN architectures within this space than my work does. But mine is a minor extension by providing sort of that dual action and state value function drawn from the Wang 2015 paper as well. The main contributions, though, in my view, is this sort of direct comparison of these methods and providing these ideas that incorporating behavioral elements increases performance, but at the same time, relatively simple methods, especially those that are learning, and even better, those that would assume a behavioral underpinning, do quite well and are not generally destabilizing. And sort of stated very succinctly, I view that this work from a manager's standpoint shows that policies can be like locally focused and still achieve globally preferred outcomes. You don't necessarily need a black box DQN to do high levels of performance within the space. You can get by with relatively simple, stable assumptions, though marginal learning about your environment has significant improvements as well. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'd encourage you to look at sort of the publicly posted code and also the current draft of the paper. I welcome comments and feedback, and I hope I get a chance to see everyone again in person in the near future. Thank you.